Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Tammy, Jo, and Peter Discuss Kinky Movies. We're here with our third Kinky movie, and today we're going to look at a movie called My Mistress from 2014. And I'll tell you a little bit about the movie in a moment, but I'd like Peter to introduce himself first.
Hi, my name is Peter Tupper. I'm a kinky historian, writer, author, educator, group organizer, and I'm also working on a project to research the role of BDSM in mainstream media.
Cool, thanks. I'm TammyJo Eckhart, and I am an author, former kink activist, still a kink educator, and a historian, and we decided we want to start talking about movies. So today's movie, My Mistress, is an Australian movie. It was made in 2014, and just a couple of things I wanted to share about the movie that I think will give people some insight to what we're talking about at different points. First is that the film had two different prodoms that it consulted, one from Brazil called Callous Mercy, and one from France called Mistress Francois. So, you know, the movie, I think, took it seriously in that they went as far as to get two prodoms and talk to them about things. Not all movies that we'll probably talk about that use kink in them go that extra step.
Yeah.
The other thing I want,
why do they go to Brazil and France?
well, I think,
are there no prodoms in Australia?
I don't know. The main female character is French.
Yeah.
She's a French actress and she's playing someone who is French. So that makes some sense. I don't know why they want someone from Brazil. Maybe they had equipment they wanted or something, or were known for doing something in particular. And then I want to talk about the age of consent, because that is an issue that is a big part of this movie. The age of consent in Australia varies from state to state and territory to territory. In the territory where this movie is set, which is in Queensland, the age of consent for men and women both is 16, and has been that way since 1899. So, you know, looking at it from an American and possibly Canadian viewpoint, some of these things may have been concerning to us, but I don't know whether or not they would have been as concerning to the Australian audience watching. Peter, do you think you can give like a really short synopsis of the movie, or is it's too complicated to do?
Okay. This is about Charlie, a teenage boy living in Australia. He seems a bit aimless at first. We see him sort of just biking around his neighborhood. He's drinking and smoking. I'm not sure about the legal age for those, but in Australia, he has a moment where he exchanged a glance with a French woman who's moving into a house near where he lives. Then he comes home, finds that his father has committed suicide, and then, you know, and his mother is in the next room having a party, unbeknownst to her. So he and his mother are obviously both very upset about that. And he becomes very angry with his mother, starts like accusing her of things. He also finds out that she's having an affair with his best friend at the funeral. He has he meets the French woman Maggie at a playground, and they sort of form a momentary connection, at least, because then he sort of inserts himself into her life, working as he basically sneaks into her property and goes into her house looking for her. This is where he goes upstairs and finds that she has a dungeon studio in one of her house's rooms upstairs and is in mid-session with a man. She chases him away. Then he goes back, presents himself as a yard worker answering an ad she posted. And this is sort of the beginning of their relationship. as it goes along, he starts becoming involved in her SM scenes with her. He also sees that she's involved with another man who seems to have some sort of hold over her. In the credits, he's called Client X. We also see that Maggie had her young son taken away from her, and is being, now are we doing the complete summary, plot summary here?
I would just do a really short summary
Okay.
here. Yeah.
So Maggie and Charlie have this sort of peculiar relationship. He's obviously sexually attracted to her, and he keeps pushing to get to know her better, and she keeps setting limits. He keeps going over them, and she keeps giving in and letting him be a bigger part of her life. They become sort of each other's confidant, but we also find out that Charlie talks about how his father committed suicide. Maggie reveals that she had a drug problem, which caused her to neglect her son, and her son was taken away from her. This eventually escalates to a fight between Charlie and Client X, who is apparently her social worker, who's also kind of blackmailing her.
Yeah.
And that's when Maggie throws both of them out of her house. This is when Charlie reconciles with his mother and gets his life sort of back on track. And Maggie is reunited with her son. And the last image is Charlie in wearing what I'm assuming is a school uniform on a PE run through the woods, and he sees Maggie with her son at a playground, and that's the last contact between them. So it's basically a coming of age story.
Yeah.
And I would also put it in sort of the genre of young man sexually initiated with older women. That I actually made I looked up a list of these types of movies on IMDb, and they were very popular in the early 80s. I think maybe people are a little more touchy about, a little more sensitive about sexual relationships with large age differences. So it's a coming of age story, young man initiated into adulthood with SM, sort of a layer of SM on top.
Yeah. I would say it's really a story about, recovery from grief.
Yes.
In a sense, for both of them, though it is very much from Charlie's viewpoint most of the time. Yeah. So let's look at some more questions that we had here. So I mentioned the age factor initially. So just so that people are reassured, no matter what you think, the main actor whose name, and I'm consulting my notes here, Harrison Gilbertson, was 20 or 21 when he made this movie, or when the movie came out. And the lead actress, Emmanuelle Berhart, was 40 or 41. So they're both adults, but there is an age gap there, a definite age gap. So we each watched this several times before we talked about it. When you first saw the movie, did that upset you? The reported age gap? Because he actually tells her first when he when he manipulates his way into working for her, that he's 18.
Yeah.
I think she suspects he's not, but he does tell her that. And then later we learned from his mother that he's 16.
Yes.
But how much did that bother you?
I mean, I looked up the age of consent in Australia and found the same things you do. There's what's legal and there's what's right.
Yeah.
And I think that you can definitely end up with I think that this takes a slightly too I think the film takes a slightly too rosy view of this kind of relationship, that this would be something that a young person could just sort of pass through on the way to a normal, whatever that means, adulthood. I think that this is something that even if it's not, I mean, may not, even if it's legal, it's something that could kind of mess a person up
Mhm.
at at a young age. And um, especially when you're dealing with, Charlie, who's dealing with the sudden death of his father, and his mother's infidelity. And I got the impression that even before that, he was kind of a troubled kid. Like the first time we see him, he's smoking and drinking in plain view. It's like he just doesn't care what other people see him doing.
Yeah, his
So,
parents are having a Christmas party, it looks like, a holiday
yeah,
party, and he's not there.
yeah.
And, you
So
know,
I think he was a kind of a troubled kid even before that.
yeah.
So the way I the way I look at this film as it's the fantasy that animated all those young man, older woman movies back in the day, and it's still there. There's still this there's I think this sort of hints at the double standard we see in this kind of thing. It's the idea that, you know, older man, younger woman is a horrifying abuse of power, and a younger man, older woman is somehow okay or acceptable. And I don't think it is in real
Mhm.
life. I don't think it is. The only way I can sort of accept this movie is basically as a fantasy
Mhm.
and not take it terribly realistically. Um, and I think that goes into a lot of like the way the characters are handled. It's not a very naturalistic movie. The world's very empty. You get the feeling that it's like, all these empty spaces these characters move through. I don't think until the end we ever see Charlie interacting with anybody his own age.
Yeah, it's like
So
where he lives for miles and miles, there are no other teenagers, male or female.
yeah.
And
So um we don't it's like the best way I process this is don't take this as super realistic. Take
yeah,
this as a fantasy.
yeah.
And now how did you handle that whole business about the age difference and whether we're supposed to see this as good or bad?
Well, for me, there is a bit of realism here in that I don't know if you remember being a teenager, but it's actually really common for teenagers to get crushes on older
Oh
people,
yeah.
and fantasize about older people. And so the fact that he would like, before he even finds his dad death, like sees this woman who's, when she's out in public, she's
Mm.
dressed kind of sexy. We don't see other women dressed quite that sexy. And I kept going, is
Well,
this just a carryover of her Dom persona, or is it just this is how they dress in France and she just has not bothered to change since moving to Australia?
I don't know. I mean, like his mother was wearing in the party at the very beginning. Her mother was wearing a fairly sexy dress
Yeah,
when
but that was like in their house, so it
yeah.
was more of a private space.
Yeah,
And
but I think I'm yeah, but I think it's like, you see, this goes into the fantasy thing because I have a hard time viewing Maggie as a real person. Like
mhm,
because um, she lives somehow she has this house out in the middle, this huge house out in the middle of nowhere with a pool. Um, and we don't know how does she afford that. We're told
yeah,
that she is from France. She had some guy, the guy who got her hooked on, I think it was heroin, brought
yeah,
her over.
who was a
um,
client.
yeah, a client brought her to Australia. So is she a citizen? If and like she had her child taken away from her, but wouldn't she get deported or something? Like there's so much. The story is so vague.
Yeah, and she just recently moved into that house
Yeah,
too. And
yeah,
that's the problem. We're not giving, except what she tells Charlie.
yeah.
We're not really given a lot of her background. Like, I almost think for a moment the social worker who's blackmailing her, clearly they're not having what she's used to having with a client. Because when we see them together, they're much more like pseudo romantic.
Mm,
But she's still clearly not herself. She has on like wigs,
yeah.
she has on costumes, and he says at the end something to her about, but what about all our plans? And it makes me almost feel like she's moved into this house and maybe is seeing clients and stuff because it's part of his plan.
Yeah,
And,
I mean,
you
yeah,
know,
he's got this whole, I mean, he's got, that's very vague. Like I don't think we even get his name, but he's
yeah,
the guy who's I'm trying to help us, and he's very intrusive on that. But it's like, why does Maggie have to be French, for example? I mean, it's the stereotypical exotic
yeah,
French woman, the exotic foreign woman with the sexy accent, and she wears high heels almost all the time. Um,
yeah,
she's got this super cool American car in her garage. She's apparently into bit into the occult, and like tells him, witchcraft, tells him, do this incantation to help yourself sleep and things like that. So
yeah,
I just didn't feel she felt like a teenage boy fantasy of a sexy older woman rather than somebody with a life of her own, with a realistic, like, we don't really know like why she does this, how she got it, why she's a pro dom. And so I just had a hard time accepting her as a real person.
yeah. The way that Charlie those lies and manipulates the situations
Yes.
to get closer to her, without naming names, let's just say there was someone in my family who happened to be female, and she would behave in very similar ways to get closer to male teachers. And
Mm,
so teenagers can do this, teenagers do this,
yeah.
but of course it always then falls upon the adult to say, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
So when I was reading, that's how I was interpreting. I was like, I think there's even stuff going on with Charlie that we don't know about that has pushed him to be this aggressive. Because
Yeah.
he does some really, I mean, if she wasn't dealing with her own issues with getting her child back, I mean, had she been me, I would have called the cops several times on him because
Yeah.
he's destroying property. He threatens to
Stalking
commit
her.
suicide at one point if she won't let him back in. It just keeps escalating.
Yeah,
Um,
and she doesn't slam down and say no. And she's the adult here.
yeah,
He's not.
yeah,
He should know better.
yeah,
And um, yeah, so this is why I kind of feel like she's just, you know, that suspension of, again, it just feels like a fantasy rather than, I think it's more like maybe the realization that these were two very messed up people at a particular part. And the best interpretation I can put on this is these are two very upset, very distressed people who happen to mesh at this point in their lives.
yeah,
And they should probably look back on this in the sense of, this was a shared mistake. This was a folie à deux.
yeah,
But like, she, at the end of it, Maggie says, the like, almost like the cliche of the older woman, younger man scene is like, you're going to make some woman very happy or something like that. And it's like
yeah,
she's saying, there, you're better now. You've been initiated into adulthood or manhood or whatever. And I think it's probably more like, this would really be, realistically, this would be more of a tragedy of two very, very damaged, needy people, um, sort of like colliding with each other.
yeah. But I do think at the end they do help each other
Yeah.
get over their grief. Like, he's finally able to make amends with his mother, and I think have some empathy. For I'm not the only one suffering because my father's committed suicide. My
Mhm.
mother's also suffering, and maybe it's time for me to stop being so selfish and childish and step up. He thinks
Yeah.
about, he wants to keep one of his dad's suits because he's like, I'll save it for when I'm older. So it's like
Yeah.
he's suddenly starting to think further down. I think that's what you're
Yeah.
supposed to get from him being on the running team too, is he's integrating himself more into the things that
Yeah.
society says he
It's,
should. And she gets her kid back
right.
and leaves that house. So we don't know what that means for like her career or whatever,
Yeah.
but they do seem to walk away better than what they started, which isn't, by the way, for anyone listening, saying you should go have affairs with people who are younger and older. Um, that's not what we're saying. We're just saying, I think that within the movie, they might think back on it, and I don't feel like they would necessarily feel like, geez, I'm a terrible person for having done this. They might just think that was a thing I did. It probably wasn't very smart, like you were saying, it was a mistake, but
Mm.
I've moved on and I learned.
Yeah.
So that was how I interpreted it. And
Yeah.
you're completely right that if the genders of these characters had been reversed, it would have been like, I think the motivations would have been very different too of the characters. We would have had, the evil older man and the sweet innocent girl, or it would have been like the total horror movie thing where like the young girl goes all ballistic and starts like killing animals and putting them in his bed or something.
But money boy.
Yeah. So
Yeah. I
yeah,
think,
so
yeah. There's something that's bothered me is that, and I can only assume this was deliberate. Why do the mother character and Maggie look so similar? They look kind of like, Maggie kind of looks like a slightly younger version of Charlie's mother. And, they're both blonde haired women that, often wear heavy lipstick, red lipstick. And I was wondering, I always found that very peculiar. And it's like, his mother is able to like put down a boundary and say, at one point when he's been just like being a complete ass to her. And his mother at one point says, I have to ask you to leave because I cannot live with somebody who hates me.
yeah,
And, but she also says, I hope dearly, if you don't do this, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. And I want you to come back at some point, but I can't live with you now. And she's like, this is like the 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 smart thing that honestly Maggie should have been doing.
yeah,
Should
yeah,
have been saying like, I can't take this anymore. This is what we're doing to each other right now is horrible, and we can't do this anymore.
yeah.
So
Though I do think within Maggie's character, I mean, she keeps trying to do that and he pushes back. And then she gives in, though the way she gives in changes over time. I think given what we learn about, a client introduced her to drugs and who moved her here and losing her kid and the social worker who's blackmailing her, I think she has difficulty saying no. I think she has difficulty thinking of herself first. I think when she's in dominatrix mode, she puts on these costumes, she's playing a role, but even when we see her playing the role, she seems more focused on the client. Like she has this mantra we hear over and over again where she invokes a goddess and it's going to teach them to love better and they're both going to be in these roles. But I never think it's for her. It always feels like it's for the client. And she has
well,
some really specialized equipment, which makes me think these clients are giving her specific objects for her to use.
well, she's a professional, and like
We
we talked
assume.
about, and
we assume. I
yeah.
mean,
Well,
given
I
things that
mean, yeah,
happened,
he says like they you spank them for money, and he says, yep, a lot of money. And so, like we talked before in the previous one when we talked about going under and Suzanne, one of the things I talked about was how there's in prodoms there's this delicate balance of fulfilling the client's wishes and fantasies and maintaining their own status as like this professional, not just a wind-up doll. I am an artist, I am a professional, I have, particular talents, and I don't just, follow the script of the guy who gives me money. And I think that, sidebar here, we've gotten quite a ways into discussing this movie without really discussing any of the SM stuff, any of the SM scenes.
Yeah.
And I think that to me shows just how sort of grafted on that felt, because you could have cut those scenes or even like just make her more of a vanilla sex worker, make Maggie a vanilla sex worker. And the movie would have gone pretty much as it goes.
Mhm.
We wouldn't have to change much. So to me, those scenes between with Maggie and her clients and with Charlie, they feel just they feel like they don't mesh with the rest of the story. Like we don't see we don't see the before or the after of these things.
Mhm.
We don't
Yeah.
see them talking about this. We don't see them sort of debriefing from it. Like, so it does feel, it doesn't integrate well with the rest of the story. So I think that Maggie, again, we don't see her negotiating with clients. We don't see her negotiating with Charlie.
Mhm.
So we don't really know her attitudes towards what she does. You know, we see her wearing very elaborate fetish costumes. She seems to wear high heels most of the time. Um, you know, she was like the first time he sees her, Charlie sees her in the dungeon, she's like wearing the full, I think it was latex with the big shoulders and the pointy boobs and all that. And she's got her own coffin. She does a puppy play scene with a guy. So
She's
we
got a
don't,
carousel horse, which was
yeah,
just like, I'm just like, okay. I'm like, that would never have occurred to me to put in a dungeon,
well, why not?
you know?
And you know, these got these padded whatever you call them, cushion walls and things,
Yeah,
and
which are probably soundproof.
yeah, and the Valkyrie painting,
Mhm.
yeah. So, which incidentally, the opening shot is that painting, and that was almost exactly like the opening shots of Going Under
Yes,
with
yes.
the Bill of the Mystery. So, was that a deliberate? Anyway, so I think that I honestly don't know about. Again, that's another point where Maggie is just not developed. How does she feel about these? Uh, how does she feel about these clients? How does she feel about getting into this? Um, is it just something she does for money? Is it something that she enjoys doing? Is it something she does in her personal life? Because like the only other person she's here involved with is client X, and he seems to be like he almost like he seems to be blackmailing her into this sort of much more vanilla relationship, like
Yes.
they're dancing or he's holding her.
Yeah. And when you see her face and stuff and the way she's like her body is tense and everything, it's pretty clear she's not liking it. She's not into that.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think it all has to do with sort of getting into that fantasy thing, right?
Mm.
Charlie has these fantasies. Maybe this is like the idea of a young teenage man's
Yeah.
fantasies, teenage boys' fantasies, but that's kind of what she's doing with her clients too. You
Yeah.
know,
I
it's
mean, we see that bit of like there's that bit where after he sees her the first time in the outfit and everything, we see him masturbating, and we don't see him, but it's strongly implied he's
yeah,
masturbating in the shower. And we see him fantasizing about her with the black wig and the whole outfit and the bullwhip and everything. And
and doing things which are not, wrapping a bowl up around someone's neck and things like that that are not things we actually see her do.
yeah,
So it's like his fantasy of what
yeah.
this would
And
be like.
we should mention that Charlie's father hung himself,
Yes.
so which is might play into that. So, but yeah, so we see that, but we don't see, like, for example, he there's a bit where she comes home and she finds out that Charlie has handcuffed himself to the carousel horse, and he's holding the key in his mouth, and she's demanding, spit it out, spit it out, spit it out, and he's refusing. And I think she's just come back from that scene where she saw her son and came back, and she's very upset about that,
Yeah.
and she's kind of just mad and frustrated. And that's when Charlie just refuses to give her the key, and she grabs a crop and literally starts beating him, and the scene just ends. We don't see what happened after that. I mean, at some point he must have released her. Sorry, she must have released him with the key, but we don't see the conversation after that.
Mhm.
We see like his mother like sees the marks on his back, but he doesn't see, we don't see how Maggie and Charlie talked about that afterwards. Did they not talk about it at all?
No, I
Did they
think
just,
that's when they have the scene where he comes in and she has the tea inside and she's like, you came into the house
yes.
after
But
she,
that
lay,
was like, yeah, but that was a day, that was after he went
yeah,
home
yeah,
and had the scene with his mother. And then he came back to her place and then they talk about it. And which is more of him just going over her limits and basically, sorry. And, and so it's like, I think he's, so yeah. And again, we like the bit with where he's in her coffin watching the puppy play scene through that little hole. We don't see the aftermath of that. We don't, like when we finally like leads up to her like hitting him with the cane.
mhm,
We don't see the aftermath of that either. Like she gets to the she obviously goes too far and starts hitting him too hard, and he safe words, and that's what stops her. But she sort of just staggers like she just came out of a trance or something. But
yeah.
again, we don't see them talk about that. I like it just, this is sort of the lack of realism, maybe not realism, but it's a sense of like we did this but we don't talk about it. And that to me is a recipe, that's a bad way. It just doesn't, I just don't believe that there wouldn't be some talk after this.
Yeah, they have, I'm trying to look at my notes here. They have this conversation after which, and I think it's after it's after this when they have the tea outside in the pool because he refuses to go away. And it's at that point where she's like, what do you want? And he's like, I want to do what you tell me to do. I want what you want, which
Yeah.
is a lie.
Yep.
Because repeatedly we see that what he wants is what he wants. But she comes back with her writing crop. And that's when they start having this relationship that looks a little bit more like what he thinks. And I kept wondering, is she doing this in an attempt to scare him away? And because it isn't working.
No.
He seems to run harder towards her. And since we're talking about the kink aspects of this, at first when she's like, okay, you want to do this, is what we're going to do. I looking at her like, okay, so she's doing voice control and an attitude adjustment there. Like, this is how you answer politely when someone's giving you tea, which I discovered would probably be actually le goûter, which is sort of the French version of afternoon tea, because of what she brings out, the types of sweets she has with it, and that she's French. So it's slightly different than afternoon tea. She does that, and he does things now like help her on with her clothes. She seems to have some sort of rule that he's not supposed to touch her. And when he does touch her, then they go into what looks to be like an actual scene.
Yeah.
For the first time. And this is where she says, like, here's your safe word. When you say it, I'll stop. And this is where things kind of went both sideways and realistic for me at the same time. He can't take what her clients can, because honestly, he doesn't really understand what any of this is.
Oh yeah.
All he knows is that when he goes home and takes a shower or something, he's thinking about it, it turns him on, it gets him off. And he's getting attention from this older woman whom I completely agree with you, looks a lot like his mother, but is foreign and exotic and seems to have all these things he wishes he could have, the house and the fancy clothes and the strange car and all this stuff. So he can't take as much as she's used to. And she doesn't hear him the first time he says the safe word. And then he cries and he says it again and she stops and she loses it.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
She is beating herself up left, right, top to bottom. Just she's having a fit. He's clearly just taken a shower and come down, and he doesn't know how to respond to her being upset with what she's done. And again, they don't talk about it.
Yeah.
He just leaves and then comes back the next day and is surprised that she doesn't want to see him anymore.
Yeah.
Because
That
to
was,
him, it's just this fantasy. His fantasies keep getting fulfilled. What's wrong with it?
yeah.
Okay, so we've been talking about, the kink scenes and things like that, but let's approach it from a slightly different angle. How is kink represented in this movie? Is it represented as healthy, unhealthy, or a mixture? I myself have mixed feelings about that because I think we see that Maggie can do very well with some of her clients, like, the one who's being a puppy, her mantra that she has, invoking this sort of sacred space. She has, she seems to have the ability to figure out what her clients want and to give them what they need. She checks in with the puppy client. For example, we mentioned that Charlie's in the casket watching. The first thing we hear her say to the puppy guy, you're going to be watched. Are you okay with being watched? And he nods. Now, if he'd said no, would she have stopped? We don't know, but maybe it's something that they've talked about before. We just don't have that background. So I think in some ways it can be seen as healthy, but then I think there are some very unhealthy things that are shown too. For example, the not talking about what they're going to do. The fact that she's being blackmailed into having a relationship with someone else under the facade of, she's still using her dresses and her equipment, even though it doesn't look like what they're doing is S&M at all. And then it's just the fact that she got into drugs through a client. I mean, it kind of says she's a pro dom, so she's got to be messed up in some way. On the
Yeah.
other hand, she has gotten clean and she's working to get her son back. So I feel like it's a mixed message.
Yeah. It was, that's, again, I have a hard time sort of making sense of Maggie as a realistic person. I don't, is, for example, if she's, if she's trying to get her son back, I know, I mean, I looked up that sex work is relatively decriminalized in Australia. They have very liberal laws regarding sex work compared to America. Um, but I also don't know if she wants to get her son back, I don't know if that would actually necessarily reflect well on her. So is her social worker also keeping this a secret? That he's claiming she has some other job, and that doesn't make any sense there. I think it sort of goes with how it goes back to Charlie, for example, when he at one point he asks her, "Am I going to be one of them when I grow up?" Meaning her clients. And I get the impression that this goes into my sense that his sexuality doesn't really make a lot of, again, it's still forming, it's still, there's still, he doesn't have a good sexual understanding of himself yet.
Yes.
So I think that if a true masochistic person, he would look at what these men are doing with Maggie and he'd say, "Oh, okay, I can understand that. I can relate to that." He seems to look at this and not really understand it, and certainly not empathize with it. I mean, we have that scene where he's masturbating to the thought of Maggie, and there's a lot of shots of him looking at her, especially looking at her shoes and her feet and her legs. So I think somebody involved in this movie has a shoe foot leg fetish. Um, so he may have that, but like when, for example, she like lightly taps him with the riding crop during the tea scene, he doesn't seem to like, he doesn't enjoy that. He doesn't seem to really get that. He sort of has to adjust to it. And the scene where he has the safe word, I get the impression that up until she actually starts doing impact planner, he's enjoying it. But then it's like, okay, I can't mentally adjust to this. So he may just be a guy who, he may have a shoe foot boot fetish, stockings, etc. And he may like, or other fetish wear, but he may not have that particular masochistic, whatever it is, that would make him enjoy that kind of intense physical sensation. I mean, there is that moment where he asks his mother to hit him. He's like, they're in another fight and she tells him, hit me, and she won't. But I also think it's like, yeah, so I think he's like, he's seen this and he's like sexually attracted to Maggie, but he doesn't fully understand SM. He doesn't understand his own desires. We don't know what kind of sexual experience he's had already, with hopefully with people his own age. We don't, sorry, there's a siren. Don't, so I get the impression that he like encountered this and figured I'm going to go as far as I can with this, but he doesn't really understand what it entails. And so that's why the scene where he, you know, you've got this train wreck situation where he doesn't understand his own limits or interests. She doesn't, is too upset to like recognize her own restraint, to restrain herself. And so she goes really hard in on him, and he has to like beg her to stop before she does. And that's when she's all wrecked and like,
Yeah.
like she kicks off her shoes, which I guess is the strongest sense of her kicking off that identity.
Yeah.
So I think it's like he doesn't necessarily. So we have Charlie, who may be a fetishist, if you want to be technical, but not a masochist. And you have Maggie, who is a pro-dom, but we don't know if she is into this in her personal life, whether it's something she just regards as a job or is something she regards as more for identity. And we had that same discussion when we were talking about, again, we go back to Going Under, because like, we weren't really sure if Suzanne, you know, she works as a pro dom, but then she quits and is like, is this something she would do in her personal life if money wasn't an issue?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also, I think Charlie, he likes to think that he's taking care of Maggie, that he's doing things to please Maggie, because they have those couple scenes where she can't go back to the house. She's revealed to him that she's lost her child and why. They go back and discover, oh, there's the social worker again. She's like, I can't. He's like, let's not. And they go out. He takes her like he would take a teenage girl out on a date. They go to an arcade. They play, is it Dance Dance Revolution or a similar sort of thing? And she actually has fun.
Yeah.
You know, she has fun with that. And then they sneak into his room, and I don't know how drunk she actually is or how much that is her pretending.
At the arcade, they're both drinking from a wine bottle in a paper bag.
Yeah, but there were times when she's like looking at him and she doesn't seem nearly as drunk as she's pretending to be. And he thinks because she puts her hand on his thigh that they're going to have sex, and he scrambles to get a condom. She's like, we're not having sex. And they don't. You know, because he doesn't know where to go. And he keeps saying to her during those two scenes, I just want to take care of you. I just want to take care of you. So I kept thinking, if he has any inclinations at all, he might be more like a service top with a fetish. You know,
you see, this is where I almost wish that they had focused more on that and seen like it taken, put more screen time into that type of formalized relationship, because you know, like the bit with the tea, the bit with him taking her on taking that leather harness thing off of her. I wanted to see more of that, and all these scenes kind of like seeing like these little set pieces that don't really gel with anything else.
Yeah.
And so that's what I wish. But also, like, just to go back for a moment, when they're in the arcade, there's that scene of the three young teen boys, like just at Maggie, and it's like, okay, this is like, I read this as Charlie's, you know, his ego at like, I can, you know, look at the super hot older women I'm with. So I felt that was almost more important and it's that's a teenage boy's fantasy, or a man with the mentality of a teenage boy's fantasy.
Yeah.
Um, and another thing that that's something I've noticed in other in the other movies we've talked about, like in Whips, in Love and Leashes, we talked about how the camera spends a lot of time on the male submissive and looking at him, her looking at him. We get to see a lot of his sort of appreciation of how handsome he is and everything. So there's that. It's avoiding the usual conventions of the male gaze.
Mm-hmm.
There's some similar elements. It's a little more balanced, but in Going Under, because like we do see sort of him, he's a lot more buff than he probably would be in reality, but it's definitely like they do a lot of time looking at him, but they look at her too. In My Mistress, it's very much about the camera lingering on her, and she's a beautiful woman, especially, and often it's explicitly from his point of view, like the bit where she's walking around in her red soled Louboutins, and he like pops his head out of the pool and he's looking straight at her shoes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, there's very much like her looking at him, him looking at her. That's not the same way around. We don't get shots of her looking at him, and he's not a thing to be looked at in the same way that she is. I mean, there is the closest thing is that bit where the client, the social worker, is like looking down at the pool and watching him swim.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the sort of the closest thing of like him as an object to be looked at. But this is very much a male gaze movie.
Yeah, and when we do see Charlie like in the shower, and when he's just in the towel and his mother notices the mark, it's us as the audience seeing him. It's not her. Maggie never looks at Charlie like in a longing way or a passionate way or a desiring way. And I think that's because she's allowing herself in this case to be manipulated into giving into him whenever he crosses these boundaries. And so I don't know if she feels like some sort of kindred spirit with him, or she feels sorry for him, especially after he reveals that his father's committed suicide. She does seem to have a great deal of empathy for him then. And I think her attitude changes a little bit at that point, but that's, it doesn't seem personal to me. Whereas his interest in her is both at the same time her as a sex object, but he really wants to know her as a person too. So he's like trying to balance those two things.
Yeah, I think that she's not a sexual agent in this film, because like we see her as, we don't get her in the sense that she's sexually attracted to Charlie. We don't like her relationship with the social worker. That's got this creepy blackmail thing going on with it. There's the clients. We don't, again, so she's not a sexual agent. And that's why what I think is maybe the biggest problem, the scene I have at the biggest part is like, he's basically throwing this complete tantrum, Charlie. He's throwing her stuff into her pool. He's yelling outside.
And she looks scared. She's inside the house looking terrified.
But it's like, why does she give in? It's like she comes in and it's like, it's like she's setting the terms of them finally having sex, but it's like she's doing it like she feels obligated to him, like she owes him something. And I think that is a big error here. That makes it feel like it should it's basically like, she's emotionally blackmailing her into sex. She's not doing it because she wants to, because she's going to take pleasure from it or anything like that. It's basically saying, I'm going to raise a fuss until you do it. And that just kind of like as, and that's seen as like the culmination of their relationship, not a SM interaction, just a plain vanilla interaction. And it's like, it's presented as this like reward she's going to give him, not in the sense that she's obliged to give him, not in the sense of her own pleasure, her own connection.
Yeah, and
So
it doesn't even work though, because she's
yeah,
like, you're gonna come over here, we're gonna have sex, and you're gonna leave. But then the client comes back and we see that she's sitting on one couch, he's laying down another couch, they haven't left. But we
yeah,
actually don't know if they had sex, because this is
yeah,
coming, we want to talk, we
yeah,
see her breasts at one point,
yeah,
but we see them kissing, but it doesn't go further than that in the movie,
yeah.
which
And
actually
then the next
surprised
one,
me.
yeah,
Usually
the
this
next one,
type of movie would show a lot more sex.
mm,
And then, and then he and the blackmailer get into a fight, because the blackmailer literally tries to grab her.
yeah,
And that's when she comes down the stairs with the blow-ups and tells them both to get out. But that
yeah,
still doesn't work, because Charlie comes right back.
mm,
And
yeah,
what I noticed was, when he comes back, it's like she's just like, I'm moving, and she just kind of sits next to him and lets him do most of the talking. And that's when he says, I think we shouldn't see each other again. It's kind of like he had to get to the place where he made the decision or had the realization that this cannot go on, because clearly, short of moving, of literally just moving and not letting him know where she was, he was just going to keep coming back.
yeah,
Though apparently she didn't go that far, because how could he have run, he's got to be like at his high school, right, in like cross country or something, and they're running through park, and there she is with her kid. So
yeah,
clearly she hasn't gone that far, which would make sense. I mean, I suppose the state may be saying, we're still going to watch you and make sure you're okay even though you get the kid back. But yeah, it's just, I was surprised by how much fetish stuff there was, like but it's almost all clothing on her. A lot of it's
yeah,
clothing on her. And then that really shocked me that there wasn't more sex. Because
yeah.
usually if you're going to spend so much time with the female being objectified,
I
there's
don't
going to be
know
a lot of
that
sex.
yeah, I mean, the most nudity you get is like you see her breast or a body double's breasts for a bit. That's it, really. And I don't know how the rating system for film works in Australia, how much nudity. I always assumed Australia was a bit more liberal about these things, but I might be wrong about that. Um, but it's still like the idea that this is the most messed up part of this. It's like this idea that she doesn't owe him anything.
Yeah.
They if he's if anything, he's messed up her life even more in a ways. Like I mean, I'm not saying this is was there was a the most charitable way I can say this is that they're two damaged people who were licking each other's wounds for a bit.
Yeah.
But I don't think she owes him anything. That should the bit where she lets him back in and says, okay, we're gonna have sex, but it's like, no, you're the adult in the room. You draw the limit.
Yeah.
You don't let him wear down your resistance like this.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
should know better.
Yeah, exactly. Or you do what one of my high school teachers did when, I shared about a relative of mine. One of my high school teachers arranged for me to always be there. When, when my relative had to have like lessons with this band instructor, I was always there. And he came to me and said, I'm not comfortable with her because of some things she's doing. I know you're related. Would you mind? And that's how he protected himself, because he couldn't, as a teacher, just say, get out of the school, because then he would have had to talk about it with the school administration and stuff. And, that's, I think as an adult, you don't want anyone to think you're either coming on to someone who's younger or that you can't handle it. Neither looks good, or you think it doesn't look good. But yeah, so yeah, I agree. They have a really weird relationship. And when she made that deal, like, we're gonna have sex, I was just like, and I've seen this movie, I'd seen it before, which is why I suggested we watch it. And I watched it again a couple more times here. And each time when that happens, I'm just like, why? Why? It's just not connecting in my brain that this is the smart thing to do.
I think, yeah, this is why, again, like the character of Maggie doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's why I kind of interpret this as a male fantasy rather than a sort of psychologically realistic. And it actually reminds me a little of um, like going back to almost like the classic text of male submission, female dominance, which is Venus in Furs.
Mhm.
Um, Venus in Furs ends with Severin uh, being rejected by Wanda, and he goes back and he returns to his sort of ancestral home. He talks about how I live in my father's house now. He's taken up his responsibilities as part of this, of like the conventional patriarchal society he lives in. And we see a similar thing with Charlie, because like he reconciles with his mother, he goes back to his house, he takes one of his dad's suits and says, I'm going to wear this when I'm older. And when the very last scene of him is him running with other students his own age, so he's sort of back in mainstream society again. And I felt like this is the fantasy here is that he can do this and be initiated into the next stage of psychological development of masculinity or whatever, the path towards adulthood.
Mhm.
And that's the fantasy that drives all of these movies and these stories that oh god, I remember when I was a kid, I remember, I think it was called it's a movie called One of the Guys, and it had this girl who was going to high school pretending to be a guy, and she was like binding her breasts down, and she forms a relationship with another teen boy her own age, and they at one point talk about if they're virgins, and the guy says, yeah, I did it once. This friend of my mom's had sex with me after my dad died. And I was like 13 when I saw this or something, probably too young, but I remember thinking, oh, is that what happens? You like when your dad dies, like there's this custom of you like some older female woman and it sexually initiates you. Thankfully, I was disabused of that idea pretty quickly, but it's like, it is this idea that somehow this is going to happen, and it's going to go better. This is better than like trying to have sex with a person your own age or whatever. And I don't think it is I think it's well, it's not necessarily a bad fantasy, but it is a fantasy that I think can sort of steer you into um, uncomfortable areas, bad areas.
Yeah. Oh, and it reinforces patriarchy too,
Yeah,
because it kind of goes to the idea that like, there's this myth in the Wild West that one of the father's duty was to take his son into the saloon or
yeah,
whatever, and for like one of his birthdays pay one of the prostitutes, again the older woman initiating the younger man into a sexual relationship.
yeah,
It's this idea. It's also, as you were saying, that just occurred to me, this is kind of like Corinth, ancient Corinth, where one of the major temples there, one of the rites that they did every year is that any man could go in and pay a fine and have sex with any woman who was functioning as representative of the goddess. It's weird because it's the goddess Artemis, and you don't normally think of her as as being a sexual goddess, but in
yeah,
Corinth she was, and that was like, again, this rite of passage that men in the patriarchy had a right to pay this, but also this religious connotation. It makes me think about Maggie with her mantra and creating this sacred space.
yeah,
I also tapped into something that you brought up when we talked about going under, about the concept that the pro-dom is kind of like a psychologist or a therapist, or in a sense you could say that's what clergy is too. Clergy sometimes functions as a therapist, as a go-between you and higher powers, and that's kind of what Maggie is setting up here with her clients.
yeah. It's the dominatrix as caregiver
Yeah.
that we talked about in Going Under. And recurs so often in media depictions of prodoms.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think that's yeah. So this is why I was kind of surprised that you recommended this, because it's to me not a very good. I don't. It's a very much a male fantasy film,
Hmm.
and the two most prominent women in it, which are Maggie and his mother, they're both kind of, well, okay, his mother comes out as actually, I think, as a more together, as a better, more realistic character than Maggie does. Like, she feels like a person who is, who is extremely upset about the loss of her husband, or her son treating her so badly, her guilt over having had this affair. But she also, like, says, okay, I'm going to take charge of my life. I can't take this from you, Charlie. I can't take this from you anymore. And so she steps up and is the responsible adult in the room. Maggie is not. Maggie is, you could almost do like a Jacob's Ladder movie scenario, where Maggie is just that woman Charlie happened to glimpse when he was out biking. And all that other stuff is just his fantasy about her.
Yeah, I did wonder that when you were mentioning fantasies, because like, what if she's just like a woman he saw there, and
Exactly,
then he sees
yeah.
her again at the park, and the entire stuff in between is how he's been processing his
Yeah,
grief.
he just, that was him
Yeah,
jacking out his
yeah.
masturbatory fantasy about it.
But I do think that this movie is very well acted.
Hmm.
I if it seems a little over a top at time, I feel like grief can make you do things that are over the top at time. And I the kink elements there, they're very visual, but there are some hints that I think they got their money's worth from the prodoms. I think the prodoms to discuss things with them and talk about things, because I don't know that like your average person would have thought about things like creating a sacred space, or each client needs a different thing,
Yeah.
or talking and figuring out what someone wants. And it could have easily, a lot of these movies we talked about off camera, a lot of times if you have prodoms or an SM, there's like some sort of crime that happens, some sort of murder or crime or things like that. And there is blackmail here going on. But otherwise, it's very much a drama. And I think it's, as a drama, I think it's fairly solid. Like I cared about Charlie, and to some extent I cared about Maggie. Like, it's like I kind of feel their pain, when they were emoting their pain, I really felt for them.
Yeah, I think this could have been, I don't know, I'm always faced with the temptation to want to rewrite something and how I would change it. And that's kind of, I don't know if that's a fruitful avenue, but I think that this could have emphasized that Maggie and Charlie relating via the Dom sub relationship. I think that could have been a bigger part. And that could have been like her, Maggie finding a way to assert herself and not get taken over by the emotional needs of others, because I feel like she's just overwhelmed by these men making demands of her. And like, her strongest moment is when she's on the stairs cracking her bullwhip and yelling, "Both of you get out of my house," which is to Charlie and the social worker. But that's kind of the high point for her, and it's all down from there.
Yeah.
So
let's kind of wrap things up by trying to talk about how much time is this movie supposed to cover? Because it begins with this holiday party, so sometime around Christmas. So if Charlie's in school, I'm guessing some sort of Christmas break, but then we don't see him having to go back to school.
Yeah, he says his father's death was 3.5 weeks ago at one point.
Yeah, is that when they're in the car and he finally tells her that his father's committed suicide? So is this just like a month? Is this stuff just happening in the course of a month or so?
I think so. And
that's really fast.
Maybe he's playing hooky or something from school, or
I suppose he could have like a past because his father's
Yeah, he might have a bereavement. Is that the right term? Bereavement? Anyway. Yeah.
Yeah,
So again, there's a lot of things I don't sort of like, like I was trying to figure out the exact legal status of Maggie. Is she a citizen? Is a naturalized citizen of Australia? If Where does
yeah,
that work? There's a lot of these logistical things I wasn't terribly interested in because I was more interested in how the relationship worked. And um, so that's I kind of feel that in this movie the SM was there to kind of like up the stakes, create visual appeal. Like the title and the posters, most of the like decorative art that goes
mhm,
with this movie I've seen are of Maggie in her like full dominatrix outfit and the black wig and all that. Sometimes just herself, sometimes with Charlie. And it's not, and to me, it doesn't, as I said before, it just doesn't fit. It seems sort of like grafted on to increase visual appeal.
yeah. I think if you saw some of the posters, you would be surprised
Yeah,
by the movie. You'd be like, wow, this is a lot more of a drama
yeah.
than I was expecting.
It makes
Now
me,
we talked a little bit about what if she wasn't a dominatrix? What if she was something else? But what about if Charlie wasn't a high school student? What if he was like done with that? He was actually 18
yeah.
and had taken like a year off college, or this happened while he was in his first year of college. Would that have changed the
Um,
dynamic?
a
I mean,
little bit, in the sense of at some point you have people are entitled to make their own mistakes.
yeah,
And and there is that, and Charlie's mother is still trying to be a mother to him, still trying to look after her son. And if he was a few years older, it would feel I think there would be a different element if he was already on his own for a while. He's still living at home. He's still living in a bed. He still really doesn't know what he's doing with himself. So yeah, I mean, you could have made him a young man. I think that would have been a little less. I almost feel that this is courting controversy, that it wants to be seen as daring, um, which is why they make him like a 16-year-old and not an 18-year-old or older. Uh, so I think that was, but it doesn't really have the guts to go through with a realistic assessment of what that is, and it remains stuck in the fantasy.
yeah, yeah. And I was trying to, learn more information about the movie and find more images and stuff we can include in this video. And I was just surprised how little was
Yeah,
out there to find. And I don't know if that's because it's just been lost, but we hear that nothing ever goes away on the internet. So I don't know. I mean, the actors, um, the lead male actor, he's done a few things. The French actress has done several things, almost all of them in France, though. Actually, the
mhm,
woman who plays the mother has been in a lot more things.
yeah,
And there were times when I wish she'd had a little more time on screen or a
yeah.
little less time on screen. One or the other, because sometimes I was like, why are you back there again? And
Yeah,
other times I was like, let's spend more time with her. So,
this is the director's only feature so far.
yeah.
So, yeah, mainly what this movie did is made me think about other movies that I liked more, because there's so many bits in here that reminded me of Going Under. There's bits that reminded me strongly of Mistress, which is a 1976 French film that we have not discussed, which I'm inclining to think we should.
Mhm.
So it just, I don't think it really succeeds in its to it goes beyond, it doesn't really think through, it's too enmeshed in the fantasies. It doesn't think
Yeah.
through realistic consequences.
Yeah. It's more disconnected.
Yeah,
Whereas Going Under, it was very connected,
yeah. Going
and
Under is a
Love and
very,
Leashes was like this, this developmental relationship,
yeah,
and no pro element at all.
yeah. Love and yeah, Going Under was a very tight film. It's very went deep into both their characters in I think a realistic way. So We have only have less than 4 minutes left.
Yeah,
That's my final wrap up. I just don't think, I didn't like it very much. What's your final wrap?
I liked it as a drama, but in terms of, and as you know, talking about conflicted emotions and sexual desires in teenagers and people's problems. But yeah, I agree. The kink stuff was just not integrated as well as it could have been. But at least no one got murdered. So in that sense, I wasn't as disappointed as I have
Yeah.
been by others. But you know, we'll keep talking about these, and you know, we'll see ones that are good and ones that are. I'm afraid we're probably going to see ones that are mostly bad. I think that's probably the majority of movies with kink in them. But I think it's still important to talk about them,
I agree.
and because you know, you and I both have real life experience. And so we can bring something to this that like Roger Ebert can't, or I don't know, who's the new up and coming.
Yeah,
Tell
well,
how old I am by saying Roger Ebert, right?
yeah, we've been doing 2 years, but I guess we can, is that a wrap?